Knitting by Faith. Dedication. As promised, this book is dedicated to my 5th grade school teacher, Mrs. Ann Chambers. This is not the original book that I wrote about my runt of the litter cat, which I had promised to have dedicated to her. Nevertheless, my promise to dedicate my first book to you has finally been fulfilled. Introduction. It is a truth almost universally acknowledged that a knitter, while knitting, thinks. A knitter's thoughts can be about the project at hand, which yarn to buy next, what to make for dinner, or solutions to the world's problems. The process of knitting allows a knitter to use both sides of the brain by using both left and right hands simultaneously. This can lead to some focused thinking and meditation. When that knitter is a Christian, the thoughts can invariably lead towards faith. In my case, the result is the book you are reading right now on my Kindle. In 2009, I came home from a 2-week trip to India where I had spent time teaching women to knit. While processing the experiences and still jet-lagged, I wrote out a rough story of some of my experiences. After 2 more trips to India to work with women and teach handcrafts, I actually went 4 times, I visited the story and polished it. As other writers critiqued it, I began to realize that the story of my experiences in India would make a good ending to a book on knitting and faith. I already had other short pieces written, some that I've used while teaching in India, and others as they came to me while I was knitting. Knitting by Faith was born in those moments, and you can read the piece that started it all in my chapter 12, The Day I Checked My Knitting. The following chapters are written from the perspective of an evangelical Christian. Other than a few years of Bible college, I have no formal theological training, and this book should not be taken as such. A professor of theology once told me that our theology changes and should change as we grow in faith, keeping essentials the same, but the gray areas can alter. This writing reflects my perspective at the time of this publication. These reflections are shared with you so that you may be encouraged, strengthened, and challenged in your knitting and faith. May you knit on through all circumstances with courage and faith. Chapter 1. Master Knitter. Sleep that knits up the raveled sleeve of care. William Shakespeare, Macbeth. I once dreamt that I was in God's throne room. It was evening and many people were dancing and having fun in the open area in front of the dais. I sat on the outer edge of the dance floor, up a slight rise, and took as much enjoyment in watching the people as they did, dancing. I was content to be there and sat knitting a pair of socks to the rhythm of the music. Jesus walked towards me and asked if he could sit next to me. I immediately said yes and scooted over to make room for him. He sat down and then he did something that surprised me. From a fold in his robe, he took out a ball of yarn and some needles and started knitting with me to the rhythm of the music. We knit together, watching the dancers, and I felt a deep, companionable joy. I stole a few glances at his yarn and needles and couldn't quite figure out what he was knitting. Inevitably, I asked the question that knitters have been asking each other since the beginning of yarn. What are you knitting? Would it be a pair of socks like I was working on? A chemo cap for a cancer patient? Or even a prayer shawl? Jesus didn't answer me in words. He held up his knitting and he showed it to me. The knitting wasn't any specific garment that I could recognize. I studied it curiously. And then all at once I realized that I was sitting with the master knitter of all master knitters. I shouldn't have been surprised, but it hadn't occurred to me before that Jesus knew how to knit. As I sat there with a simple project of hand-knit socks, he was knitting people, situations, and life. And of course, he was good at it, because after all, he invented the art of knitting. He created sheep and alpaca, goats, Angora bunnies, and all fiber-bearing animals. He created cotton plants, hemp, flax, and all fiber-bearing plants. And if that wasn't enough, he owned the sheep on 1,000 hills, never mind the cattle. I began to understand that Jesus knits better than anyone else could ever comprehend. His knitting was beyond yarn and needles. Our method was a mere shadow reflecting his art. He knit together the universe, the earth, and the people. His fiber is everything and everywhere, including our souls and lives. Whatever he works and knits together in his hands will not need to be ripped out. He is the master knitter of master knitters. He put his project in his lap and then held out his hand to see what I was knitting. My pair of socks now felt like a childish scribble, but I held them out to him anyway. He smiled and admired the work that I had done, mistakes and all. I could never come close to his skill, but I could do my best with the abilities that I had been given. When I awoke, the dream was still strong upon me. I felt an acute sense of connection to other knitters, present and past. After all, I had been sitting next to the master knitter who showed me how ancient his craft was. That day when I picked up my needles and worked on my socks, my knitting felt a little more sacred in my hands. As the yarn slipped through my fingers, I felt as if Jesus were still there, knitting with me. I was inspired to knit something that would have meaning and connect with others. I could pray for the person whom I was knitting. I could make something to give to someone in need. I could teach others the craft, as many knitters have done before me. Knitting could become a form of ministry, whether the recipients knew it or not. I would no longer be merely knitting an item. Instead, I would be knitting comfort, love, and care. A few years have passed since I knit with the master, but I still think often of him sitting in his throne room knitting. Perhaps he is sitting there knitting by himself, but I believe that he often goes out to sit with other knitters, as he did with me. He doesn't join others in their knitting to show off how great a knitter he is and how much worse their knitting is in comparison. There wasn't a feeling of inadequacy when sitting with the master knitter. Instead, there was a feeling of companionship in a joint venture. He joins with us that we can experience fellowship with him. Chapter 2, Lifeline. She selects wool and flax and works with eager hands. Proverbs 31:13. Knitting a sweater may not seem like a spiritual practice, but finishing my tangled yoke cardigan became one for me. I fell in love with the pattern when I first saw it in a magazine. A simple knit cardigan with a row of cabling across the yoke. I chose a cranberry-colored yarn and cast on. The main body of the sweater was knit from the hem up and was fairly easy in stockinette stitch. I knit the two fronts and back as one piece. The sleeves were finished next and then attached to the body of the sweater. The instructions and photos of the pattern showed that the rows of cable were next to knit. I have always loved to knit cable patterns, but this pattern looked more complex than any I had done before. If I made a mistake here, it would be difficult to rip out the stitches and find where to start again. And if I couldn't figure out how to restart the pattern, I might have to rip back even farther and lose hours of knitting. Since I did not want this to happen, I took preventative measures and chose to put in a lifeline. A lifeline can be made up of any strong, thin thread or yarn that is drawn through all the stitches on the needles. The string must be thin enough that it won't affect the knitting, yet strong enough not to break while it holds the stitches. Lifelines are used in case you make a mistake and have to rip back. It means that if you mess up bad, all you do is unravel to the lifeline and you can start over without too much trouble. When the piece is finished, you simply pull the lifeline out. It's a little like putting a bookmark in your knitting. I chose to use some waxed hand quilting thread I already had on hand and threaded my lifeline through my stitches. I began the cable pattern and attentively followed each chart symbol and every instruction to the letter. Each row of cables was so complex it took almost an hour to finish. This was fine by me because I love cables and seeing them form beneath my fingers. After a few hours, I noticed that the cables didn't look like the picture in the pattern. I did a few more rows and put some more hours into it, but it still didn't help. Frustrated, I threw the cardigan down and took a break. The next day, I ripped out the rows of cabling back to the lifeline and started over. Surely, I had been reading the chart wrong and just needed to review. After a few rows of more cabling, it was clear that I was still doing it wrong. I threw the sweater down with a little more meaning this time. Days later, when I thought the cardigan had had a long enough time out, I came back to inspect it. This time I noticed something that I hadn't seen before. When I turned it inside out, I saw the cables that should have been on the outside on the inside. I had been reading the chart backwards, from left to right instead of right to left. I know that you read charts from the right to left, but on the instructions it had told me to go from left to right on the setup row. It hadn't said that after the setup row I needed to switch to reading the chart from right to left. In my nervousness not to mess up, I had taken the pattern instructions too literally and not used common knitting sense. I ripped back to the Lifeline a second time. This time I worked smarter. I made up a swatch, a sample piece, and tried the pattern from right to left. Voila! The cables worked. It looked like the picture shown in the pattern. I started once more with the cable pattern on the cardigan. Finally, the cables began to form beneath my fingers. By this point, I knew the pattern so well that I almost didn't need the charts. Each twist and swoop of the cable was exciting to watch as it formed into a recognizable pattern. All too soon it was over, and I only had the rest of the neck to knit and the button bands. The next week, I was wearing the sweater. The spiritual practice that I experienced while knitting the cardigan was in the Lifeline. Just like life, I can sail along with the everyday stitches of stocking knit and garter stitch. These stitches are perfectly functional, if a little dull at times, but I know that around the corner there could be some complicated design feature thrown my way. I may not always have a pattern or pictures to see what things should look like ahead of time. I also may not always understand the directions or follow them correctly, but that's okay because I know that I have a lifeline to fall back on. I can thread my life with a lifeline of faith. When things go wrong, I can fall back to the strength of the lifeline thread and start over. My faith can be built during everyday life while things are going smoothly. This faith can be strong enough to stop my life from unraveling later. This reminds me of the man who built his house on solid ground and not the sand, as mentioned in Matthew chapter 7, 24 through 25. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rains came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against the house. It did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. Therefore, I would be wise to build the foundation of faith during the times the sun is shining, and hold on to the strength of that foundation when the rain pours down and the winds blow. This foundation will stand secure against any inclement weather, allowing the pattern of my life to form under the Master's hands. Chapter 3. God doesn't make mistakes. Properly practiced knitting soothes the troubled spirit, and it doesn't hurt the untroubled spirit either. Elizabeth Zimmerman, Knitting Without Tears. When someone sees something I've knit, they only see the finished product. They don't see the hours that I sat stitching, the times I started over, or the mistakes that were fixed or left unfixed. They usually admire the object and say that they can never do that, unless, of course, that someone is a knitter who will flip the item inside out and study it with a practice eye and find those unfixed mistakes. I'll confess that I don't always go back and fix my mistakes, even if they're not too hard to remedy. I am a process knitter and enjoy the process of knitting more than having the finished product. If the mistakes aren't too obvious, I can be happy with the result. Sometimes mistakes look just as good or better than the original pattern. There is a pattern in knitting called the mistake stitch. At one point in knitting history, someone tried to knit a pattern but didn't do it correctly. Instead of taking it apart and starting over, the knitter saw that the pattern they made was just as pretty as the pattern they were supposed to make and named it. I like to tell those that I teach to knit that there are no mistakes in knitting, only just new pattern or design features. I call my mistakes Amish moments. There is a traditional belief that the Amish quilters intentionally put a mistake into each quilt they made because only God can make something perfect. Lucky for me, I don't have to put in my mistakes intentionally. They happen spontaneously. I will never be a perfect knitter or a perfect person or even a perfect writer. Though I knit many mistakes in my projects and in life, I know that there is one who does not make mistakes. When some people look at my life, they may have seen a mistake at the very beginning. I was an orphan who was adopted from South Korea. As an infant, I was put in an orphanage with no family reference, name, or even a birth date. Was my birth a mistake because my parents couldn't keep me? Not at all, because God does not make mistakes. He had a plan for me and planned it even before I was born. David wrote in Psalm 139, verse 13, "For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb." To human eyes, I was an accident, a mistake. But in God's eyes, I was destined to be adopted by a Swedish and Norwegian Midwestern family. You betcha. My family adopted 3 girls, of which I was the 3rd, after they had miscarried 3 baby girls. Our family would not be complete without any one of us. Children are not accidents. Rather, they are all unique patterns and design features. God knew each of us even before we were born. He has a purpose for everyone, even orphans with no family history. We are all here because God took out his knitting needles and cast us on. Like a person admiring a hand-knitted object, let us admire in each other the way God has created us. Even if we can only see with human eyes, may we resist the temptation to turn the other person inside out while looking for their basest flaws. We are all projects in progress. In God's eyes, we are not mistakes, but intentional creations from his hands.